Okay, now let me show you how to use the new configuration system in ASP.NET Core. So first, let's go to appsettings.json. So this is our new configuration file. Instead of web.config, we're going to store all the configuration settings here. Just like the previous version of ASP.NET, here we have connection strings, and we can have a key value pair, default, and set the connection string to server, localhost, database, Vega, user ID, SA, and password, my complex password. This is the password we set when installing SQL Server using a Docker image. If you're using SQL Server on Windows, instead of user ID and password here, you can use integrated security. So let's add the password here. Okay, so this is our connection string. Now we need to read this in our startup class. So here we have a property called configuration, which is of type iConfigurationRoot. And if you look at the constructor of the startup class, you can see this is where we initialize this property. So let's see what's happening here. We're using the configuration builder class to build a configuration object. In ASP.NET Core, we can have multiple configuration sources, and we register all these configuration sources using these methods here. For example, here on this line, we're registering appsettings.json as a configuration source. Below that, we're registering another file that starts with app settings, but it has the name of the environment in the file name as well. So with this, we can duplicate this file and change it to appsettings.development.json or appsettings.production.json. And the settings we put here will override the settings we define in appsettings.json. Because in our startup class, we're registering this file as a configuration source after our main appsettings.json. Now, the last configuration source we're registering here is the environment variables. So earlier in the last section, I introduced you to one environment variable called ASP.NET Core _environment. So with the order we have registered these configuration sources, if I go to appsettings.json and add ASP.NET Core _environment and set it to development, and then later on my machine, I set this environment variable to production, that production value will override this development value here. Okay, so delete. So over these few lines, we're registering multiple configuration sources. And then in the last line, we call the build method, which creates a configuration object. Now with this configuration object, we can find the value for any keys irrespective of where that key is stored. So this is an example of decoupled architecture. Now, back in configure services, while registering our DB context, we need our connection string. So I'm going to use this configuration property. Here we can use an index, which specifies the name of the key. So connection strings, default. So if you have a hierarchy, we can use to access subkeys. Then there's also another way to get access to this default configuration. So instead of using an indexer, we can use get connection string method. And this will look under connection strings. So here I just add default. Okay. All right, our DB context is ready. Next, we're going to use code first migrations to create our database.